The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of Bethlehem as young David guided his father's flock toward fresh pasture. At 17, his hands were already calloused from years of shepherding, his shoulders broad from wielding the sling that had saved countless sheep from wolves and lions. But today felt different. The air itself seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't name. David paused beside a weathered olive tree, its ancient branches offering shade from the climbing sun. The sheep grazed peacefully below, their bells creating a gentle symphony across the valley. He pulled out his small wooden harp, fingers finding the familiar strings as a melody began to form, one that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his own understanding. "The Lord is my shepherd," he whispered, the words flowing like water from a spring. But as he sang, something extraordinary happened. The sky above began to shimmer, not with heat waves, but with something far more profound. David's eyes widened as he saw what appeared to be figures of light moving through the heavens. Not angels, as the priests described them, but beings of pure radiance that seemed to acknowledge his gaze. "You see them too?" David spun around to find an elderly man approaching, his beard white as mountain snow, his eyes holding depths that spoke of decades watching the sky. The stranger's robes were simple, but there was something about his presence that commanded respect. "Who are you?" David asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his sling. "My name is Ezekiel," the old man replied, settling onto a nearby stone. "And I've been watching you, son of Jesse. The heavens have been speaking about you for some time." David's heart raced. "Speaking about me? I'm just a shepherd." Ezekiel smiled, an expression both kind and knowing. The youngest son, overlooked by his own father when the prophet Samuel came calling. Yet the Lord sees what man does not see. "Tell me, David, what did you witness in the sky just now?" David hesitated, glancing upward where the shimmering had faded but not disappeared entirely. "I saw light, beings of light. They seemed to be watching, waiting." "They are the Watchers," Ezekiel explained, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Ancient beings tasked with observing humanity, recording our deeds, our choices. But lately, they've been doing more than watching. They've been preparing." "Preparing for what?" Before Ezekiel could answer, a distant horn echoed across the valley, the sound that summoned all able-bodied men to Bethlehem's center. David's stomach dropped as he recognized the urgent pattern of the blasts. "War," he breathed. Ezekiel nodded gravely. "The Philistines have moved against Israel again. Their champion, a giant named Goliath, challenges any man brave enough to face him in single combat. Your brothers have already gone to join King Saul's army." David began gathering his sheep, his mind racing. His father had forbidden him from joining his brothers, deeming him too young, too inexperienced. But something deep in his chest, a burning sensation he'd felt since childhood, told him this was the moment everything would change. "You must go," Ezekiel said quietly. "But know this, young shepherd, what you witnessed today is only the beginning. The Watchers have marked you for something far greater than defeating giants. Ancient secrets sleep beneath the earth of this land, secrets that have waited centuries for the right king to awaken them." David stared at the old man. "King? I'm the youngest of 8 sons. I have no claim to any throne." "The Lord has already chosen you, David. Samuel's anointing oil may have run down your head in private, but the heavens proclaimed your kingship long before that day." Ezekiel stood, his eyes reflecting the afternoon light in ways that seemed almost supernatural. "But with great calling comes great testing. The secrets you'll uncover will challenge everything you think you know about faith, about heaven, about the very nature of reality itself." As David secured his flock and prepared to return home, Ezekiel placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. "Remember this day, son of Jesse. Remember that the Watchers chose to reveal themselves to you. When the weight of the crown becomes unbearable, when the secrets threaten to consume you, remember that you were chosen, not despite your youth, but because of the purity of your heart." The old man began to walk away, then paused. "One more thing, David. When you face the giant, do not trust only in your sling. Trust in what you cannot see, the forces that move in the spaces between earth and heaven. They will guide your stone to its mark." David watched Ezekiel disappear over the hill, then looked back up at the sky. The shimmering was still there, subtle but unmistakable. As he made his way home, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life as a simple shepherd was about to end forever. That night, as his father Jesse reluctantly agreed to let him carry provisions to his brothers on the battlefield, David lay awake, staring at the stars. Each point of light seemed to pulse with purpose, and somewhere in their ancient dance, he sensed the beginning of a story that would reshape not just his own destiny, but the fate of Israel itself. The watchers were indeed preparing for something, and David, the shepherd boy who saw light where others saw only sky, was about to discover that some secrets were worth dying for, and some were worth living for, no matter the cost. The valley of Elah stretched before the assembled armies like a wound in the earth, its dusty floor bearing witness to 40 days of stalemate. David arrived at the Israelite camp carrying grain and cheese for his brothers, but his eyes were drawn immediately to the Philistine side of the valley, where a figure of impossible size paced back and forth, his voice booming across the divide. "Send me a man to fight!" Goliath's challenge echoed off the surrounding hills. "If he kills me, we will be your slaves. If I kill him, you will serve us." David felt the familiar burning in his chest intensify as he watched grown warriors, men he'd looked up to since childhood, shrink back in terror. His brother Eliab spotted him and approached with anger flashing in his eyes. "What are you doing here?" Eliab demanded. "Who's watching the sheep? I know your pride and the evil in your heart. You've come just to watch the battle." "I only asked a question," David replied calmly, though his attention remained fixed on the giant. "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel?" Nearby soldiers overheard and began explaining the king's promise: riches, the king's daughter in marriage, and freedom from taxes for the winner's family. But David barely heard them. Something else had captured his attention entirely. Above Goliath's head, invisible to everyone else, David could see them. The Watchers. 3 beings of pure light hovered in the air, their forms shifting like flames in a breeze. But these weren't the same benevolent observers he'd seen while shepherding. These creatures radiated something darker, their light tainted with shadows that made David's skin crawl. "You see them." David turned to find a young soldier beside him, no older than himself, with eyes that held the same recognition David felt stirring in his chest. "You're not the only one," the soldier continued quietly. "My name is Jonathan. I'm King Saul's son, and I've been watching the sky since I was old enough to hold a sword." David studied Jonathan's face, seeing both strength and vulnerability there. "How long have you seen them?" "Years, but never like this." Jonathan pointed subtly toward the giant. "Those things above Goliath, they're not here to observe. They're here to empower him. That giant isn't just flesh and blood, David. He's been touched by something from above. Something that doesn't want Israel to succeed." The revelation hit David like a physical blow. "Then how can any man defeat him?" Jonathan smiled grimly. "Perhaps it takes someone who can see what we see, someone the right kind of watchers have chosen." He paused, studying David intently. "The prophet Samuel spoke of you, didn't he? He anointed you in secret." David nodded, surprised by how easily the truth came. "But I don't understand why. I'm nobody special." "Special enough that you can see through the veil between earth and heaven," Jonathan replied. "That's not a gift given lightly." Their conversation was interrupted by King Saul's approach. The king was a giant himself, head and shoulders above most men, but his face was etched with worry lines that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible burdens. "You're Jesse's son," Saul said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I hear you want to fight the Philistine." "Yes, my lord." David straightened, feeling the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. "The Lord who delivered me from the lion and the bear will deliver me from this giant." Saul studied him for a long moment, and David could see the internal struggle playing out in the king's eyes, desperate hope warring with the responsibility of sending a boy to his death. "If you're determined to do this," Saul finally said, "at least wear my armor." David allowed himself to be fitted with Saul's bronze helmet and coat of mail, but the weight was impossible. The armor that should have protected him instead made him clumsy, vulnerable. He removed it piece by piece, much to the horror of the watching soldiers. "I can't fight in these," David explained. "I'm not used to them." Instead, he chose 5 smooth stones from a nearby stream, placing them carefully in his shepherd's pouch. As he selected each one, he whispered a prayer, and to his amazement, the stones seemed to warm in his hands, as if responding to some unseen power. Jonathan approached as David prepared to descend into the valley. "Whatever you see up there," he whispered, gesturing toward the sky, "don't let it distract you. The watchers that serve the Most High are gathering too. I can see them forming ranks behind you." David looked back and gasped. The sky above the Israelite camp was beginning to fill with beings of light, but these radiated pure, clean energy that made his heart sing with recognition. They were forming what looked like battle lines, preparing for a conflict that would be fought on levels far beyond the physical. "This isn't just about defeating a giant, is it?" David asked. "No," Jonathan replied solemnly. "This is about something far greater. The secrets Ezekiel spoke of, they begin here with this moment. What happens in the next few minutes will determine whether those secrets remain hidden or begin to unfold." David nodded, understanding flooding through him. He walked down into the valley, aware that every eye in both armies was upon him. Goliath's laughter boomed across the space between them. "Am I a dog, that you send a boy with sticks?" the giant roared. "You come against me with sword and spear," David called back, his young voice carrying clearly in the still air. "But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, whom you have defied." As David reached into his pouch for a stone, he felt something extraordinary happen. The burning in his chest expanded, filling his entire being with a power he'd never experienced. Above him, the Watchers of Light moved into position, their forms blazing brighter as if drawing energy from his faith. The stone left his sling with a sound like thunder, guided by forces beyond the physical realm. It struck Goliath in the center of his forehead with impossible precision, and the giant fell forward like a toppled tree. But even as the Philistine army fled in terror and Israel erupted in victory cries, David's attention was fixed on the sky. The dark watchers that had empowered Goliath were retreating, but their retreat felt less like defeat and more like a strategic withdrawal. Whatever they represented, this battle was only the beginning of a much larger war. Jonathan reached him first, pulling him into an embrace that would mark the beginning of a friendship deeper than brotherhood. "It's starting, isn't it?" David asked, still watching the sky. "Yes," Jonathan replied, "and now the real test begins. Victory over giants is one thing, David, but the secret's waiting for you, the knowledge the Watchers guard, that will require a different kind of courage entirely." As the sun set over the valley of Elah, David understood that he'd crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The shepherd boy was gone forever, replaced by someone chosen for purposes he was only beginning to comprehend. 2 years had passed since David's victory over Goliath, and his position at King Saul's court had grown from that of occasional musician to trusted military commander. The people sang songs about him in the streets. Saul has struck down thousands, but David tens of thousands. And with each victory, David felt the weight of destiny pressing more heavily upon his shoulders. But success had brought unexpected consequences. Saul's behavior had become increasingly erratic, swinging from moments of fatherly affection to episodes of rage so intense that servants fled from the throne room. Tonight was one of the bad nights. David sat in the corner of the king's chamber, his harp strings gleaming in the firelight as he played the melodies that usually soothed Saul's tormented spirit. But tonight, the music seemed to have the opposite effect. The king paced back and forth like a caged lion, his eyes darting to shadows that only he could see. "They whisper to me," Saul muttered, his voice barely audible above the harp's gentle notes. "Day and night they whisper. They tell me things, terrible things about what's coming." David's fingers never paused on the strings, but his attention sharpened. "Who whispers to you, my lord?" Saul stopped pacing and fixed David with a stare that was both lucid and terrifying. "You can see them too, can't you? The beings in the sky don't lie to me, boy. I've watched you watching them." David felt a chill run down his spine. He'd been careful to hide his ability to see the Watchers, sharing it only with Jonathan and keeping it secret from the increasingly unstable king. But Saul's perception, even in madness, was sharper than David had realized. "Sometimes," David admitted carefully, "but they don't speak to me as they do to you." "That's because they know you're going to replace me." Saul's voice rose to a shout, and he grabbed a spear from beside his throne. "They've told me everything. How Samuel anointed you in secret, how the kingdom will be torn from my house and given to you." David stopped playing, his hands poised above the strings. "My lord, I have never sought to harm you or take anything that belongs to you." "Haven't you?" Saul advanced, the spear trembling in his grip. "Then why do they show me visions of you sitting on my throne? Why do I see you wearing my crown, ruling my people?" Before David could answer, the chamber door burst open, and Jonathan rushed in, followed by Abner, the commander of Saul's army. "Father, put down the weapon," Jonathan said firmly but gently. "David has done nothing but serve you faithfully." "Faithfully?" Saul laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "He serves the voices from above, not me. They've chosen him, just as they once chose me. But I know how this ends. I've seen it in the visions they force upon me." Abner stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "Your Majesty, perhaps you should rest. The campaign against the Philistines has been demanding rest." Saul spun toward his commander. "How can I rest when they show me the future? When I see my own son loving my replacement more than his own father?" Jonathan flinched at the accusation, but David could see the truth in his friend's eyes. The bond between them had indeed grown stronger than blood, forged by shared visions and a mutual understanding of the supernatural forces at work around them. Saul raised the spear, his eyes wild with a mixture of rage and anguish. "Better to end this now, before the prophecies can fulfill themselves." The spear flew through the air, but David had already moved, rolling aside as the weapon embedded itself in the wall where he'd been sitting. He came up in a crouch, every instinct screaming at him to draw his sword, but something deeper, a voice that seemed to come from the very air around him, whispered restraint. "I won't raise my hand against the Lord's anointed," David said quietly, backing toward the window. "No matter what you do to me." Saul stared at him for a long moment, and David could see the internal battle playing out in the king's expression, the man Saul had once been warring with, whatever he was becoming. "Go," Saul whispered finally, his voice broken. "Go before they make me do something we'll both regret." David nodded and slipped out through the window, dropping onto the courtyard stones below. But instead of fleeing immediately, he made his way to the palace roof, where he often went to think and pray. Tonight, however, he wasn't alone. Ezekiel stood at the roof's edge, his white robes billowing in the night breeze, his gaze fixed on the star-filled sky above. "You knew this would happen," David said, approaching the old prophet. "I knew Saul would fall to madness." "Yes," Ezekiel replied without turning, "but the cause runs deeper than jealousy or political ambition. Look up, David. Tell me what you see." David raised his eyes to the heavens and gasped. The sky was alive with movement, not the benevolent watchers he'd grown accustomed to seeing, but something far more disturbing. Dark figures moved between the stars, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke-given substance. "What are they?" David breathed. "The fallen," Ezekiel explained, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Watchers who chose rebellion over obedience, who sought to interfere directly in human affairs rather than merely observe. They've been gathering strength, and now they move openly, influencing those in power, preparing for something catastrophic. And they're targeting Saul. They're targeting the throne of Israel," Ezekiel corrected. "Saul was their first choice, but his madness has made him unreliable. Now they turn their attention to you, David. They know you've been chosen for kingship, and they'll do everything in their power to corrupt you before you can claim your destiny." David felt the familiar burning in his chest, but tonight it was accompanied by something new, a deep, cold fear that seemed to seep into his bones. What do they want? Ezekiel finally turned to face him, and David saw centuries of weariness in the old man's eyes. The same thing they've always wanted, to prove that humanity is unworthy of divine favor. They seek to corrupt every king, every leader, every person of influence. They want to demonstrate that when given power, humans inevitably choose selfishness over service, cruelty over compassion. But why me specifically? Because you're different, David. You see through the veil between worlds, but more than that, you choose to serve despite what you see. That terrifies them more than any army ever could. A sound from below caught their attention, Jonathan's voice calling David's name. Ezekiel placed a hand on David's shoulder. "Your friend comes to warn you that Saul's madness has deepened, that he plans to hunt you down. You'll become a fugitive tonight, but remember this. Every trial you face, every moment of desperation, every choice between revenge and mercy is being watched by forces beyond imagination. The fallen will whisper in your ear, offering easy solutions and justifications for darker paths. And if I listen to them, then they win," Ezekiel said simply. "And Israel, indeed all of humanity, loses something precious. The secrets I spoke of, the knowledge that has been hidden for centuries, can only be revealed through a king who remains pure of heart, despite having every reason to become bitter." Jonathan's footsteps echoed on the stairs, leading to the roof. Ezekiel began to fade, becoming translucent in the moonlight. "Remember, David, the throne you're destined for isn't just earthly. The crown that awaits you bears responsibilities that stretch far beyond the borders of Israel. Stay true to who you are, no matter how dark the path becomes." As Ezekiel disappeared entirely, Jonathan burst onto the roof, his face etched with urgency. "You have to leave," Jonathan said without preamble. "My father has given orders for your arrest. By morning, every soldier in the kingdom will be searching for you." David nodded, having expected as much. "And you? What will you do?" Jonathan pulled a ring from his finger, the signet ring that marked him as heir to the throne. "This belongs to the rightful king," he said, pressing it into David's hand. "Someday, when this madness is over, you'll need it to prove your legitimacy." "Jonathan, I can't." "Yes, you can, and you must." Jonathan gripped David's shoulders. "Whatever you see in the years to come, whatever voices whisper to you in the wilderness, remember that some of us still believe in the man who refused to wear armor when facing Goliath. Don't let them change you, David. Israel needs a king who can see the heavens, but chooses to serve those on earth." As David prepared to leave everything behind and flee into the night, he looked one last time at the sky above Jerusalem. The dark figures were still there, circling like vultures, waiting for their moment to strike. But scattered among them, barely visible but unmistakably present, were points of pure light, the faithful watchers who had not fallen, who still served the Most High and watched over those who chose the harder path. The real battle for David's soul was about to begin. The cave of Adullam had become David's sanctuary, a limestone hollow deep in the Judean wilderness where he'd gathered a band of followers, 400 men fleeing debt, persecution, or simply the chaos that Saul's increasingly erratic rule had brought to Israel. For 3 years, they'd lived as outlaws, surviving on their wits and the grudging support of villages that remembered David's victories against their enemies. Tonight, David sat alone at the cave's mouth, watching the desert stars wheel overhead while his men slept around carefully banked fires deeper in the cavern. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant cry of a night bird and the whisper of wind through the rocks. But David had learned that in such silence, other voices could be heard. "You grow weary of running." David didn't turn at the sound of Ezekiel's voice. After years of these midnight visitations, he'd grown accustomed to the old prophet's ability to appear without warning. 3 years, David said quietly, careful not to wake his sleeping men. 3 years of living like an animal, while Saul tears the kingdom apart, looking for me. My own people suffer because of this madness. Ezekiel settled beside him on the rocky ledge, his presence somehow more solid and real than it had been in their previous encounters. "Tell me what you see when you look at the sky, David. Has your gift grown stronger in the wilderness?" David raised his eyes to the heavens and immediately wished he hadn't. The sight that greeted him would have driven a lesser man to madness. The sky was a battlefield, beings of light and darkness engaged in a cosmic war that raged across the star fields with an intensity that made earthly conflicts seem like children's games. "It's getting worse," David whispered. "Every night the battle grows more fierce, and the Dark Ones, they're winning." "Are they?" Ezekiel asked mildly. "Or are they simply becoming more desperate?" David finally turned to look at the prophet, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" 3 years ago, when you fled Saul's court, the fallen watchers believed they could corrupt you quickly. A young man, stripped of everything he'd worked for, hunted like a criminal by the very king he'd served faithfully. Surely such a person would embrace bitterness, would choose revenge over righteousness. David thought of the opportunities he'd had to kill Saul. Twice he'd found the king vulnerable and alone, and both times he'd chosen mercy over vengeance, much to his followers' bewilderment. "But you haven't," Ezekiel continued. "You've chosen the harder path at every turn. You've protected the innocent, shown mercy to your enemies, and maintained your integrity even when it cost you dearly. That terrifies them more than any army." A sound from deeper in the cave caught David's attention, footsteps approaching with the careful tread of someone trying not to disturb others. Abiathar, the priest who joined David's band after Saul massacred his entire family, emerged from the shadows carrying a leather scroll. "Forgive the interruption," Abiathar said quietly, "but this couldn't wait until morning." He glanced nervously at Ezekiel, whose presence always seemed to unsettle the younger priest. "What is it?" David asked, accepting the scroll. "A message from Samuel," Abiathar explained. "He's dying, David, and he says it's time for the final revelation." David's hands trembled slightly as he unrolled the parchment. Samuel's handwriting, once firm and bold, was now shaky with age and illness, but his words carried the weight of prophetic authority. "David, son of Jesse, the time has come for you to understand the full scope of what you were chosen for. Come to me at Ramah before the moon wanes, and I will show you the secrets that have been hidden since the foundation of the world. But know this, once revealed, this knowledge cannot be unknown, and the burden it places upon you will be greater than any crown." David looked up from the scroll to find both Abiathar and Ezekiel watching him intently. "You know what this is about," David said to Ezekiel. It wasn't a question. The old prophet nodded slowly. "The time has indeed come. Samuel speaks of the archive, a repository of knowledge left by the Watchers before the Great Division, before some chose rebellion and others remained faithful. It contains truths about the nature of reality, about the connections between heaven and earth, about humanity's true purpose in creation. And Samuel has been its guardian? One of them, yes, but he grows old, and the burden must pass to another, to the one chosen to be king, not just of Israel, but of something far greater. Abiathar shifted uncomfortably. David, if you go to Ramah, you'll be walking into Saul's territory. The risk— I know the risk, David interrupted gently, but some things are worth the danger. 3 days later, David made his way through the hills surrounding Ramah, traveling alone and disguised as a common merchant. The town where Samuel had trained young prophets was eerily quiet, its streets nearly empty, as if the approaching death of its most famous resident had cast a shadow over everything. Samuel's house stood at the town's highest point, a modest structure that had housed one of Israel's greatest leaders for decades. David found the old prophet in his garden, tending to olive trees with hands that shook with age, but still moved with practiced care. David. Samuel straightened slowly, his eyes, once sharp as an eagle's, now clouded with cataracts, but still holding depths of wisdom that seemed almost supernatural. I wondered if you would come. I couldn't stay away, David replied, embracing the man who had secretly anointed him as king so many years ago. I look like a man whose time is ending, Samuel said with a gentle smile. Come, what I must show you cannot wait for pleasantries. Samuel led him into the house, past rooms filled with scrolls and artifacts, to a door David had never noticed before, despite several previous visits. The door was made of wood so old it seemed petrified, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Beyond this threshold, Samuel said, his hand resting on the ancient wood, lies knowledge that has been hidden for over 1,000 years. The Watchers, those who remained faithful to the Most High, left this archive as a guide for humanity's future leaders, but it comes with a price. What price? Samuel turned to face him, and David was shocked to see tears in the old man's eyes. The price of absolute responsibility, David. Once you understand what you'll see in there, every choice you make as king will carry consequences not just for Israel, but for the cosmic battle between light and darkness. You'll see the threads that connect all things, the patterns that govern the rise and fall of nations, the secrets of how heaven touches earth. David felt the familiar burning in his chest, but tonight it was accompanied by something else, a deep sense of inevitability, as if this moment had been written in the stars since before his birth. Show me, he said simply. Samuel pressed his palm against the door's center symbol, and it swung open silently, revealing a chamber that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of space and time. The walls were covered with inscriptions in languages David couldn't read, but somehow understood, and in the center of the room stood a pillar of what looked like crystallized light. This is the archive, Samuel whispered, his voice filled with awe, despite having entered this chamber countless times. Touch the pillar, David, and see what the faithful Watchers preserved for the chosen king. David approached the pillar slowly, aware that he was about to cross another threshold from which there could be no return. As his fingers made contact with the crystallized light, the world exploded into vision. He saw the creation of the cosmos, the assignment of the Watchers to observe and guide humanity's development, the great rebellion that split their ranks, and the cosmic war that had been raging ever since. He saw the rise and fall of civilizations, the patterns of corruption and renewal that governed human history, and his own role as a pivot point in that vast design. But more than that, he saw the future, glimpses of what could be if he chose wisely, and terrifying visions of what would happen if he failed. He saw a temple in Jerusalem that would become a bridge between heaven and earth, a kingdom that would be remembered for millennia, and a lineage that would produce the ultimate answer to humanity's struggle with darkness. He also saw the temptations that awaited him, The allure of absolute power, the corruption that came with success, the ways that even good intentions could lead to devastating consequences. When the visions ended, David found himself on his knees, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd witnessed. Samuel knelt beside him, his weathered hand resting gently on David's shoulder. "Now you understand," the old prophet said softly. "The crown you'll wear is just the visible symbol of a far greater responsibility. You've been chosen to be a bridge between the earthly and the heavenly, a king who can see both realms and make choices that serve not just Israel, but the cosmic battle for humanity's soul." David looked up at Samuel, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and terror. "How does anyone bear such responsibility?" "The same way you've borne everything else," Samuel replied with a slight smile. "One choice at a time, always choosing what serves others over what serves yourself. The Watchers didn't choose you because you were perfect, David. They chose you because even when you fail, and you will fail, you have the capacity to learn, to repent, and to grow stronger." As they left the archive chamber, David felt the weight of destiny settling more fully on his shoulders than ever before. He was no longer just a fugitive hiding in caves, dreaming of someday reclaiming his place at court. He was a king in waiting, whose choices would echo through eternity. The real test was yet to come. 7 years had passed since David's revelation in Samuel's archive, and the wilderness that had once been his prison had become his throne room. Word of Saul's death at Mount Gilboa, along with Jonathan, whose loss still felt like a sword through David's heart, had reached the cave of Adullam on a wind-swept morning that seemed to carry both grief and destiny in equal measure. Now, at 37, David stood atop the ancient city of Jerusalem, not yet captured but soon to be, watching the sun rise over a land that would finally know peace under his rule. The city of David, they would call it, though he understood now that he was merely the steward of something far greater than himself. "The coronation preparations are complete," Abiathar announced, approaching across the rocky plateau where David's army had made camp. The priest's face showed the weathering of years in the wilderness, but also a quiet satisfaction at seeing prophecy fulfilled. "The elders of all 12 tribes wait below. It's time." David nodded, but his attention remained fixed on the sky above Jerusalem. To ordinary eyes, it appeared empty, save for the morning clouds, but David's vision had grown stronger over the years of trials, and what he saw there took his breath away. The Watchers had assembled, not just dozens, but thousands of beings of light arranged in perfect formation above the ancient city. At their head stood figures whose radiance was almost too bright to perceive directly, and David instinctively knew he was looking upon archangels, beings of such power and purity that their very presence sanctified the air around them. "You see them too." David turned to find Ezekiel approaching, but the old prophet looked different, younger somehow, his weathered features smoothed by an inner light that seemed to grow stronger with each step. "All these years," David said wonderingly, "you've been preparing me for this moment." "Not just me," Ezekiel replied with a smile. "Everyone you've encountered, every trial you've faced, every choice you've made, all of it has been preparation for what comes next." "And what comes next?" Ezekiel gestured toward Jerusalem, where the morning light was beginning to illuminate the ancient stones. "Now you become what you were always meant to be, a king who rules with the wisdom of heaven and the compassion of earth, a bridge between 2 realms that have been separated for too long." The coronation ceremony took place in the ancient ritual site outside Jerusalem's walls, where generations of Jebusite kings had been crowned before David's conquest. But this ceremony was different, charged with an energy that made the very air hum with power. As the elders of Israel's 12 tribes assembled, David knelt before Zadok the priest, who had brought the holy oil used to anoint kings since Samuel's time. But as Zadok raised the horn of oil above David's head, something extraordinary happened. The sky above erupted in light. Every person present, from the humblest soldier to the most skeptical tribal elder, looked up to see the watchers descending, their forms becoming visible to human eyes for the first time in generations. They formed a great circle above the assembly, their wings creating patterns of light that painted the morning sky in colors that had no earthly names. "Behold," Zadok whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the supernatural silence, "the Lord makes his approval known." The oil touched David's forehead, and the moment it did, he felt a transformation that went far beyond the political significance of kingship. The burning sensation he'd carried in his chest since childhood exploded outward, filling every cell of his body with power and purpose. But more than that, he felt the connection, the direct link between his mortal consciousness and the cosmic intelligence that governed all things. Visions flooded his mind. The temple he would build, not just as a house of worship, but as a literal gateway between heaven and earth. The kingdom he would establish, not through conquest but through justice and wisdom. The lineage he would father, culminating in one who would bridge the gap between divine and human once and for all. As the vision faded, David found himself no longer kneeling but standing, surrounded by his people who knelt before him not in political submission but in recognition of something sacred that had just occurred. "Rise," David said, his voice carrying a new authority that seemed to resonate with harmonic frequencies beyond the audible range. "We have work to do." The conquest of Jerusalem took only 3 days, not through brutal warfare, but through a strategy so elegant that the Jebusite defenders eventually opened their gates in recognition that resistance was futile. David had seen their defenses in his visions and knew exactly where they were vulnerable, but more importantly, he had seen their hearts and knew how to appeal to their desire for peace and prosperity. On the morning after Jerusalem fell, David stood in what would become the throne room of his palace, looking out over a city that seemed to glow with potential. Ezekiel materialized beside him, no longer appearing as an elderly prophet, but revealed in his true form, an archangel whose light was both terrible and beautiful to behold. "The masquerade ends," Ezekiel, whose true name was too complex for human tongues, said with a voice like distant thunder. "You have proven yourself worthy of the truth, David, son of Jesse." David wasn't surprised by the revelation. Somewhere deep in his heart, he'd always known that his mysterious mentor was more than human. "What happens now?" David asked. "Now you rule," the archangel replied simply, "but not as earthly kings rule, through fear and force and the accumulation of power. You will rule as heaven rules, through justice and mercy and the elevation of those you serve." "The visions showed me a temple," David said, "something that will make Jerusalem the center of the world." "Yes, a structure that will be both physical and spiritual. A place where the barrier between heaven and earth grows thin enough for mortals to glimpse eternity. Your son will build it, but you will design it according to the patterns shown to you in the archive." David nodded, understanding flooding through him. "And the Watchers, the cosmic war I've seen raging in the heavens." "Will continue," the archangel admitted. "The fallen have not given up their desire to prove humanity unworthy of divine love. But your kingdom will serve as proof of what mortals can achieve when they choose to align themselves with higher purposes. Every act of justice, every moment of mercy, every choice to serve rather than be served will be a victory in that greater war." Over the following months, as David established his kingdom and began the delicate work of uniting 12 fractious tribes into a single nation, he found himself drawing constantly on the wisdom revealed in the archive. He could see the patterns that governed human behavior, the invisible threads that connected individual choices to cosmic consequences, the ways that earthly actions rippled through spiritual realms. His court became renowned not for its luxury, but for its justice. His judgments, informed by supernatural insight, consistently revealed truth and promoted healing. His military campaigns, when they became necessary, were conducted with a precision and mercy that left even his enemies speaking of him with respect. But perhaps most remarkably, David began to see other people developing the same gifts he possessed. As his kingdom stabilized and people began to feel safe enough to seek higher purposes, more and more of his subjects reported visions, prophetic dreams, and glimpses of the watchers in the sky. "It's happening," the archangel observed during one of their regular meetings. "The barrier between realms is thinning. Your kingdom is becoming what it was always meant to be, a preview of what all human civilization could achieve." But it won't last forever," David said, the knowledge bitter in his mouth. "I've seen the visions of the future. My kingdom will fall, my lineage will fail, my temple will be destroyed. And rebuilt," the archangel reminded him gently, "and destroyed again, and built once more. The pattern will repeat until the ultimate fulfillment comes, the one your lineage will produce, who will make the bridge between heaven and earth permanent." David nodded, accepting the temporary nature of his earthly achievements while understanding their eternal significance. He was building something that would last far beyond his lifetime, even if the physical structures crumbled. Years passed, decades of prosperity, expansion, and spiritual growth that would be remembered as Israel's golden age. David grew old gracefully, his hair white as snow, but his eyes still bright with the fire that had burned in them since boyhood. He had made mistakes, terrible ones, as the visions had warned he would, but he had learned from each failure and grown stronger. On his deathbed, surrounded by his family and closest advisors, David looked one final time at the sky above Jerusalem. The watchers were there as they had always been, but now they seemed different. Not distant observers, but close companions, ready to welcome him home. "The work continues," he whispered to Solomon, his son and chosen successor. "What I've begun, you must complete. What you complete, your descendants must preserve. What they preserve, the one who comes after will perfect." As David's eyes closed for the last time on earth, they opened to a vision of unimaginable beauty, the throne room of heaven itself, where the patterns he'd glimpsed in the archive were revealed in their full glory, and where he understood at last the complete scope of the plan he'd been chosen to serve. His work as earthly king was finished. His service as a bridge between worlds would continue forever. In the years that followed David's death, stories spread throughout the known world of the shepherd king who had seen angels, who had ruled with wisdom from heaven, who had built a kingdom that stood as proof of what humanity could achieve when it aligned itself with divine purpose. And in a small town called Bethlehem, where David had once been the youngest and most overlooked son of Jesse, parents began telling their children that someday another son of David would come, one who would complete what the great king had begun, establishing a kingdom that would never end. The watchers continued their vigil, no longer divided in their assessment of humanity's worth. David's choices, and the choices of those who followed his example, had proven that mortals could indeed be trusted with divine secrets, that they could serve heaven's purposes while remaining truly human. The bridge between worlds had been built. Now it would stand forever, a testament to one shepherd boy who had chosen to see beyond the ordinary and serve something greater than himself. The end.